Welcome to Chapter 3, Session 4B of Old Testament History, Steps into the Future, Part 2. The floodgates were open, and Israel was hightailing it out of town. They were free at last, but they weren't out of danger. Moses knew full well that Pharaoh could change his mind at any time, and his people probably had few weapons and little fighting experience. But they had the Lord as their protector. I'm going to share this here, and we'll see how we do that, all right? They had little fighting experience. Of course, they had God as their protector. But another positive in their favor was that the years of slavery had made them physically strong. It was going to be a difficult trek through the wilderness, but they were physically up to it. Psalms 105:37 says, "He brought them forth also with silver and gold, and there was not one feeble person among their tribes." So that's interesting. And they also were expert shepherds, so they were able to bring all their animals with them. So the first thing in Exodus 13 is dealing with the firstborn. We're going to skip over that. The firstborn were what God claimed because he saved the firstborn in the Passover. So every firstborn belongs to God, and so the parents had to buy them back with an offering. Now, another thing I want to put to rest at this time is how some critics say that the Exodus and the plagues are all a myth. Well, let me ask this in response. Is there any other group in ancient history that claims to have received such divine deliverance as the Jews? None that I recall. The critics say that these stories were not written till centuries later, but that is not true. Moses wrote Exodus during the lifetimes of the people who experienced it. There was no gap in between the events and the writing down of that. So it didn't have time to become myth and get exaggerated like people imply, you know. So I mean, if what Moses wrote was not true, the people would have resisted it. But instead, they kept the word because it was true. Exodus 13:17. Exodus 13:17. It came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God led them not through the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, let's peradventure the people repent when they see war, and they return to Egypt. See, if they had come along the Mediterranean coast, there's a caravan route there, well traveled. That's where the ox carts went when they came into Egypt, along that caravan route. But they would have been perceived as an invading force, and the Philistines that were there would have mounted military resistance. So God said, I'm not going to bring you that way. Verse 18, but God led the people about through the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. So that's down next to the Suez Canal on the side of the Sinai Peninsula. So let's bring that up on, here we go. This is the map of the Sinai Peninsula. So the way to shore, you see across the top. That is the caravan route that goes straight towards Israel. So he did not take them on that route. You can probably see my mouse there, I think. All right. So he took them on the route that went down next to the Gulf of Suez, right through here, okay, on the Sinai portion of the Gulf of Suez. How did he guide them? He guided them with the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire. That was cool. Ha! They just followed the pillar of cloud when they were going. And you could see that for miles. Now you see the big long line in this picture? Okay? So they were following the pillar of cloud. And if they did it by night, they had the pillar of fire. Verse 18. So God led the people about through the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up harnessed. That word harnessed means marching 5 in a rank out of the land of Egypt. So that's where the 5 people wide thing that I tested the 2.4 million with and came up with a 227 mile long line. Verse 19. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had straitly sworn the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones away hence with you. So now this is an example, a good one, of the author and agent idiom, because Moses didn't carry those bones. Somebody else did. But Moses was in charge. He said, you guys make sure you do it. So that's that author and agent idiom. So verse 20, and they took their journey from Succoth and encamped in Etam in the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of a cloud to lead them in the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, to go by day and night. And he took not away the pillar of the cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night from before the people. So they walked day and night. Of course, they had to rest sometime, but they were skedaddling out of Egypt because they had to get away in case Pharaoh changed his mind. And there was no hiding where they went, because even 30,000 people walking along the path in the desert, they would have left a trail that anyone could have followed. A first grader could have tracked them. Okay? So Pharaoh, if he changed his mind, he would know exactly where they went. Isn't that something? So God guided the children of Israel through the wilderness by pillars of fire and smoke. Now, when Moses went into the tabernacle later on, God descended upon it in a pillar of smoke. Also, ornate pillars surrounded the tabernacle and later the temple. They formed the structure for the walls of the holy place and the Holy of Holies. So, pillars represent the presence of God, and they supported the buildings where God is worshipped. Also, it appears again in 1 Timothy 3. The church is the pillar and the ground of truth. God's present there. Also, mists and clouds are indicative of the spiritual realm. We cannot see into it clearly. It's beyond our comprehension. Like in Exodus 14:20, we'll begin in 14:19. The angel of God, which went before the camp of Israel, removed and went behind them, and the pillar of the cloud went from before their face and stood behind them, and it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. So after Egypt changed its mind and tracked them all the way down to wherever they were, the pillar of the cloud changed and went in the rear guard instead of in the front. And it was a cloud and darkness to them of Egypt, but it gave light by night to these, so that the one came not near the other all the night. Psalm 18:11. He made darkness his secret place. His pavilion round about him were dark waters and thick clouds of the skies. God has a secret place. The adversary can't get in there. Job 36:32. With clouds he covers the light and commands it not to shine by the cloud that comes betwixt. So it covers, you can't see. Psalm 104, verse 2 and 3. Who covers thyself, talking about God, with light as with a garment, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain, who lays the beams of his chambers in the waters, who makes the clouds his chariot, who walks upon the wings of the wind. Later on, when the tabernacle was built, Exodus 40, verse 34, well, actually when it was first built, the inauguration of the tabernacle, a cloud covered the tent of the congregation, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter into the tent of the congregation because the cloud abode thereon, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And when the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the children of Israel went onward in all their journeys. But if the cloud were not taken up, then they journeyed not till the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was upon the tabernacle by day, and the fire was on it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. Wow. 1 Kings, here's another instance of the cloud. 1 Kings 8, 10, and 11, when the temple was inaugurated. And it came to pass, when the priests were come out of the holy place, that the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord had filled the house of the Lord. So, and of course, we're going to experience that when the Son of Man comes in the clouds. He's going to come out of the spiritual realm for us, and then we're going to meet him in the clouds, and we're going to go into the spiritual realm. So shall we ever be with the Lord. So, that's really something. Exodus 14, verse 1 now. Exodus 14, verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, that they turn and encamp before Pi-Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, over against Baal Zephon. Before it shall you encamp by the sea. So, they ended up. Now, I'm taking this information from the movie about In Search of the Real Mount Sinai, and some other research I'm going to give to you in a moment. But they ended up all the way down at the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula. The traditional site for the Mount Horeb is not where it really was. That was picked out by a fortune teller, believe it or not. And there's no archaeology evidence there at all that anyone was there from a group as large as the Israelites. So the Sinai Peninsula, the traditional site for St. Catherine's Monastery and the Mount of Moses, is underneath the word Sinai on your map, and down between the N and the A, down where the trail makes this little V shape. That's where the traditional site of St. Catherine's was. but I don't think that they were there. I think that the crossing is all the way down at the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba. See, there's 5 different crossing sites. And on the map here, I have number 1. That's up at the top, above the Gulf of Suez, where there's a lake. Now, the Suez Canal goes through there now. And some people say that they crossed the Sea of Reeds there. Well, that wouldn't have deterred the Egyptians. They would have just gone around it. And then site number 2 is right at the top of the Gulf of Suez. I have a line there on the map. You can see site number 2. This will be in a handout as well. Then site number 3 is lower in the Gulf of Suez. That's right across from the traditional site of St. Catherine's. Then site number 4 is all the way over, halfway up the Gulf of Aqaba. There you can see where I have right in the middle of the water site number 4. And then site number 5 is down at the bottom in the Strait of Tyran. And that's where I think that the crossing was, because there's a natural land bridge there that I'm going to show you. But it says that they were between Migdol and the sea, and that's where that is, down there at the bottom. And so what I did is I went to the Stanford University Orbis website, and I plotted how long it would take them to travel by ox cart, by loaded mules, by foot traffic, or by a western cattle drive. All right? And the distance from Ramses up in Goshen all the way down to the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula along the seacoast, and then back up partway to the Straits of Tyran, is approximately 250 miles. All right? So, in other words, it was about 80 miles from Goshen to the Suez Gulf. Here, let me pull that up. I have this. Here is a chart that I have with all of this information. So I'll go over that. It was 80 miles from Goshen to the Suez Gulf. Then it was 130 miles from there to the traditional Mount Sinai, but I don't believe that's where it was. It was another 40 miles to the crossing at the Gulf of Aqaba, okay, and then the place across the Straits of Tyran is only 10 miles. So the crossing through the sea, the maximum would be 10 miles or 16 kilometers. All right? So, underneath there, I have a timeline. And you see the days of the month. In Nisan, the 15th, the 10th, the 15th, and the 20th, the 30th, and then the next month, the 10th and the 15th. In the second month, you see the horizontal timeline there. So Passover occurred on the 14th of Nisan. The 15th was the full moon. All right? So, if they traveled with the speed of ox carts, that's 12 kilometers a day. If they traveled with loaded mules, that was 20 kilometers a day. Foot travel, like an army, is 30 kilometers a day. A western cattle drive they were on horseback with that. That would cover 24 to 40 miles per day. Okay? Wait a minute, I'm saying miles. Let me tell you this in kilometers. I'm sorry, I'm not reading it right. And then Western cattle drive 24 to 40 kilometers a day. It's interesting to note that Roman soldiers trained periodically marching 32 kilometers in one day, which is 20 miles, and then they set up camp. And the slaves from Israel were in good physical shape, so they could do that. So then what I did is I plotted this 250-mile journey, either the fastest they could go or the slowest they could go, because we have a time limit, because it says that in the second month in Exodus chapter 16 verse 1 that they were already on the other side past Elim and Marah. Marah is where the bitter water was. Elim is where the springs were. And so they were at the edge of the wilderness of Sin in Exodus 16:1. And Marah is 32 kilometers from the seacoast on the other side of the Straits of Tyran. And it says they were 3 days' journey. So the 10th of the second month is the maximum time that they could have traveled and still gotten 250 miles from Ramses to the Straits of Tyran and crossed. So you see that underneath the 10th of the second month, the maximum time, 16 kilometers. So then in the middle there, I have 20 kilometers per day. If they traveled 20 kilometers per day, they would have gotten to the Straits of Tyran on the fourth day of the second month. And if they went as fast as they could, like a forced march, 30 kilometers a day, like a military forced march, the minimum time, they would have gotten there on the 27th, the first month. So there is almost a 2-week period of time that they could have arrived at the Straits of Tyran any time in there. So this is realistic, right? So if they traveled 16 kilometers per day, 10 miles per day, they still would have made it to the crossing point in time. Now, we know they traveled day and part of the night because it says that the pillar of fire guided them. All right? So they could have gotten there anytime during this period of time. You see? So that's plausible, in other words. They're going 250 miles to the spot where I think the crossing was, is entirely possible. Now, if they were 2.4 million, then shortly after the first people arrived, the last people would have left. I don't think that would have been the case if there were 5 people wide. You understand? So that's that chart. Isn't that interesting? So we get to the Straits of Tyran. Now this is from the In Search of the Real Mount Sinai route. And so they end up in front of 2 Egyptian outposts that are there. There was an Egyptian outpost near the Straits of Tyran. And chapter 14, verse 3. For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, they are entangled in the land, the wilderness has shut them in. Well, how would the Pharaoh know that? Because the Egyptian outposts used carrier pigeons. It would take a carrier pigeon only half a day to deliver the message from the outpost. The people are here. They're shut in the wilderness. They're trapped in front of the sea. Verse 4, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, God said, that he will follow after him, and I will be honored upon Pharaoh and upon all his hosts. That means he's going to kill them dead. That's what that means. He'll be honored upon them. He's going to kill them, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord, and they did so. So, that is the diagram about where they ended up. Now, the third controversial thing that I'm covering tonight is the actual Exodus route. Way back at the beginning of the class, I had suggested that you watch that movie, In Search of the Real Mount Sinai. It sets the tone for the whole class. If you want to see it again, all you have to do, or if you didn't see it the first time, you can Google In Search of the Real Mount Sinai, and it'll come up with, you can purchase it if you want. I have a copy, and I've shown it to fellowships at times when it was appropriate, and it really is amazing. But also there is a YouTube 45-minute length version of it. So when you Google it, you'll see the YouTube version, and you just have to put up with one ad and click on it after a few seconds, and it won't bug you. So, and then also the next best research that I have found on it is something done by Stephen Rudd, R-U-D-D, and I'm going to give you a PDF of his website. All right, so Exodus 14:5, it was told the king of Egypt that the people fled, and the heart of Pharaoh and his servants was turned against the people, and they said, why have we done this? Why have we let Israel go from serving us? And he made ready his chariot, and he took his people with him, and he took 600 chosen chariots, and all the chariots of Egypt, and the captains over every one of them. So, no reserves left. The whole army, and the best men, the captains, his top leadership, they're all going. He committed everything he had. It's a big mistake. Exodus 14, verse 8. Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He pursued after the children of Israel. The children of Israel went out with a high hand, but the Egyptians pursued after them, all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, and his horsemen and his army, and he overtook them, encamping by the sea, beside Pi-hahiroth, before Baal-zephon. So, here is the route on the chart here from the research of Stephen Rudd. So, you can see down at the bottom where it has Red Sea and Etam. All right, so they went up and they turned back. That going up and turning back was in front of the outpost. God wanted Pharaoh to see this. And so they sent the carrier pigeons, and they said, they're stuck here. They're wandering around. They went up and they came back. They're wandering. All right? But right down there at the tip is where this natural seamount is in the Gulf of Aqaba, So there on the right, you can see here's the crossing, and you can see here is shallows in the sea. You see that? That is where one of the places that they could have crossed, and this distance is only 10 miles, 16 kilometers. Now today, there is Tyran Island right here. And so the next slide is another option. Now I'm going to go back to the map here. All right, I'm going to go back one slide. Up here, halfway up the Gulf of Aqaba, is another proposed crossing site. On my map, I have it site number 4. This site is proposed by Ron Wyatt, and he is a controversial amateur archaeologist, and we put that in quotes because some of his methods are not very scientific at all, and I don't believe much of what he has quote unquote discovered. But anyway, his crossing site is up halfway up the Gulf of Aqaba, and it's not practical because it's also about 10 miles across, but it goes down deep and comes back up. All right, and on the right is a picture of the depths here at Tyran. There's one part that goes down, but most of it, even today, is only 50 meters below the surface. So if the strong east wind and God's miracles separated the waters, that's practical to walk up and down. But this site, Nuwibia, is the site that Wyatt has proposed that's halfway up. It goes all the way down 875 feet and climbing 875 feet back up. That's difficult for a crowd to go through with flocks and all that. Now, the other sites of crossing that were proposed, site number 2 and site number 3 on my map that went through the Red Sea, those are even deeper than Nuwibia. So that's not practical at all. That would be like going down in the Grand Canyon. So that doesn't fit. Here are some other pictures of the Straits of Tyran. So up in the upper left is one proposed crossing route, still 10 miles. Another one on the right, still only about 10 miles. The one on the lower left is really interesting because it is possible that Tyran Island was connected with Saudi Arabia back in early times, and so then the crossing would only be 5 kilometers. That's very practical. And then the other crossing route possible is this one here. And this is what Jackson Reef looks like even today on the far right. Here, these are above sea. Right here, these islands in the top right. And here's a picture of it on the lower right. Now, today, there are 2 sea lanes that have been carved through, one on either side of these islands. And they're one way. One's going north and one's going south. So this is where the crossing point was, I believe. And then finally, here's another picture of one of the proposed routes along that string of islands I showed you. So here is the possible sea crossing at the Straits of Tyran by Jackson Reef. So here are pictures of it from the air. So isn't that fascinating? Even today, they're still there. And then here is something really interesting. This is what God did. This is how they rise up out of the sea. Isn't that fascinating? This is one of those islands, how they rise up out of the bottom of the sea. That's just amazing. So Exodus 14:8 is where they crossed. Now, I have a whole handout from Stephen Rudd, and he actually does the same kind of thing that I did with his days of travel and the amount of travel. Now, one thing that he does is he says he allows for them resting on the Sabbath day during their trip. But I don't think they did that, because the Sabbath was not set aside as a commandment until the law was given. So I don't think that they rested on the Sabbath day when they were skedaddling out of Egypt. They were going day and night. Also, Stephen Rudd goes through an analysis of how the walls of water were created, and he says it wasn't just wind blowing. It was supernatural, because if the walls of water were separated by wind blowing, that wind would have to be tornadic in strength. And so he has pictures of the cows flying. So he said, no, it couldn't be that. So God's power divided the sea partly through wind, but it couldn't have been all wind. And then he has a lot of information that I'm going to give you in his handout. The only thing that I don't really agree with him is that he talks about water baptism. So I didn't put that part in here. But the diagrams I've shown you so far on my PowerPoint have come from his handout. And then also, he has a discussion about Ron Wyatt's proposed crossing, because one of the sensational things that Ron Wyatt supposedly discovered is chariot wheels at the bottom of that crossing that's halfway up at the Gulf of Aqaba. But the problem with that is that Egyptian chariots wheels were made out of wood. They would not have sunk down to the bottom of the sea right there where they crossed. They would have floated for a while and become waterlogged, and maybe 2 weeks later they floated to the bottom wherever they traveled to. So they wouldn't be there at that location in situ. And so he has pictures of what looks like metal chariot wheels at the bottom of the ocean. But the problem is that part there is deeper than scuba divers can go, yet these pictures are taken close up. So I don't know if they were really there, okay? And another thing that Rudd discusses with Ron Wyatt's evidence is that Ron Wyatt fudged the diagrams to make the Nuibia crossing not look as deep as it actually was. So that's a whole section in this handout that I'm going to give to you. So that's really interesting, isn't it? Now let's just get back to the word here, and we'll finish out in the time remaining. Exodus 14:8. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued after the children of Israel. And the children of Israel went out with a high hand. But the Egyptians pursued after them, all the horses and chariots. His army, he overtook them, encamping by the sea, beside Pi-Hiroth, before Baal-Zephon. And when Pharaoh drew nigh, the children of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them, and they were sore afraid. By the way, I think Baal-Zephon is on Tyran Island. So that really says where the crossing was, right out of the word. But when Pharaoh drew nigh, the children of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them, and they were sore afraid. And the children of Israel cried out unto the Lord. And they said to Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Wherefore hast thou dealt thus with us, to carry us forth out of Egypt? Is not this the word that we did tell thee in Egypt, saying, let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it had been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness. And Moses said unto the people, fear ye not, stand still, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show to you this day. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you shall see them again no more forever. The Lord shall fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. And the Lord said to Moses, wherefore criest thou unto me? Speak to the children of Israel that they go forward. But lift thou up thy rod, and stretch out thy hand over the sea, and divide it, that the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. And I, behold, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they shall follow them. And I will get me honor upon Pharaoh, and upon all his host, and upon his chariots, and upon his horsemen. They're going to be dead. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gotten my honor upon Pharaoh, and upon his chariots, and upon his horsemen. He repeated it. And the angel of God which went before the camp of Israel removed, and went behind them, and the pillar of the cloud went from before their face, and stood behind them. And it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel, and it was a cloud and darkness to them, but it gave light by night to these, so that one came not near the other all that night. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. So, in a normal year, Passover occurs soon after the equinox, so the crossing of the sea took all night. That would be approximately 11 hours. Verse 22, and the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon dry land, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. And the Egyptians pursued and went in after them to the midst of the sea, even all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And it came to pass that in the morning watch, that would have been like 3 a.m., the Lord looked unto the host of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and of the cloud, and troubled the hosts of the Egyptians, and took off their chariot wheels, that they drave them heavily, so that the Egyptians said, let's flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. And the Lord said to Moses, stretch out thy hand over the sea, that the waters may come again upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen. And Moses stretched forth his hand over the sea, and the sea returned unto his strength when the morning appeared. And the Egyptians fled against it, and the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen, and all the host of Pharaoh, that came into the sea after them, there remained not so much as one of them. It was not like in the movie where the Pharaoh stayed on the shore. Nope. He went in with them and died. But the children of Israel walked upon dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. And thus the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore. And Israel saw that great work which the Lord did upon the Egyptians, and the people reverenced the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses. Wow. What would it have been like to have been there and to seen all of this? Well, every time we speak in tongues, we have the proof of the power of God. Every time. And that's present tense evidence that we carry with us. But it's just amazing the kind of deliverance that God did for his people, his firstborn. And this is our God. This is the kind of power that is available. And this is our God that will do everything for us that needs to be done. For he will become for his people what they need for him to become. Bless you.